All right, so as I was saying before, today we're going to be learning about Django authentication. So yesterday we learned how to manually sign up and log in users, and that was a good learning experience, but it kind of took a lot of effort and it probably wasn't perfectly secure. So today we're going to be learning about some of the tools that Django provides us that will help us to conveniently and securely manage our users. All right, so we're going to be using a Postgres database for this project here. So during the break, I kind of scaffolded up a basic application just so you don't have to watch me type all this out. Calling this application Django Auth with a blog app in it. Now in the settings, you can see I've got my Postgres database, named it Django Auth. So I already created my database, just so you don't have to watch me go through these steps that we've done a million times already, or at least a dozen times already. But I've not run the migrations yet. So you can see Django is yelling at me about that, 18 unapplied migrations. I haven't written any models yet. So if we just look in blog models, there's nothing here. So it's just yelling at me about the built-in migrations, but that's actually what we're curious about right now. So I'm going to run these migrations before I've actually built any models of my own. So just for my sanity, I'm going to make migrations. That does nothing. Okay, that's what I was expecting. Migrate. Cool. So that runs all of the initial migrations. In particular, it runs the auth migrations. So that's what I'm curious about right now. So I'm going to open up pSQL to look in the database. I want to see what those migrations have already done. Just the built-in auth tables that Django is going to provide me. So let's see, I called this Django Auth. So we're going to pSQL Django Auth. So these are the tables that we have just by default after running the migrations. So remember, let's see here. If we look in the installed apps, I've got my blog app installed, but there's also an auth app installed. So any tables that belong to this auth app, they're going to be prefixed with auth underscore and then the table name. So from this auth app, there's a users table that's included. So that's here from the initial migration as auth user. It's just the user table in the auth app. So I'm going to take a look at that, see what that's got. So this is the schema for auth user. Wait, let's try that again. Okay, that's more what I was looking for. So by default, we don't actually have to make our own user table. So yesterday you saw me create a custom app user table, but that's not necessarily what we need to do because Django provides us this user model automatically. So this should look pretty familiar to you. It's got an ID, there's a password, username, email, other fields that look like they should belong to a user, like their last login time and when they joined. Lots of interesting information. And it's got the keys set up already, so we know which is the primary key. And some constraints here, so to make sure all the data is consistent and makes sense. But there is a problem with the built-in user model, which is that this doesn't like 100% match what we need from our user model. Like maybe I don't really care about first name and last name. I just need the username, or maybe I put those together into one field. Or maybe I don't want to log users in with the username. I want to log them in with their email address instead. So if I need to make any changes to the authentication system in Django, this is not very flexible. But also, you're not supposed to make changes to the default user model. So if this model right here doesn't exactly meet our needs, we're going to have to do something else, look for some other solutions. So this is coming from the Django docs. You can read it yourself at some point. Where is it? Yeah, customizing authentication in Django. This is all about all the different ways you can customize the user model to make it suit your application's needs. But I'm going to try to summarize this for you today. So there's a few options. Just use the built-in user model, all its default values. Maybe that works for you. If this is exactly what you need, then I guess you can just use it as is. But if you needed to add something in the future, that would be a pain because you'd have to switch off from the default user model to your own custom user model. So another option that the doc suggests is using what's called a profile model, where you use the user model as is for authentication, but then you can create your own model that refers to it. So this is just coming from the docs, just giving you an example of this other authentication strategy, this other user model strategy. So auth models, that's just the built-in auth from Django. This is where the built-in user model is stored. We'll import that. Then make our own model that just inherits from model.model, so it doesn't inherit from user. So this is an example of one strategy that the docs suggest. So we're using the user model as is. We haven't extended it, subclassed it. We haven't modified it. We just create our own model, employee. But one of the fields in this model is a user. So this is going to refer back to a specific record from the user table. So this is kind of a compromise between getting the full functionality of the built-in user model, but not having to deal with actually modifying it or subclassing it. So in some ways, this is simpler, but I think that down the road, this is a little bit awkward because your user is really in two separate tables between employee and user. So this is a term from the Django docs. They say that employee would be called a profile model because it's not the user, but it's like the user's profile. It's not what they use for logging in and logging out, but it has all their other data on it. So this is one approach that the doc suggests. I don't know if it's my favorite. Another option create a custom user model that subclasses from abstract base user. So this is a class that Django provides that is for subclassing. Like if you want to make your own user model, you're not supposed to subclass from user, but they provide you this class, abstract base user, that you can create subclasses from, that you can inherit from. So this is the most flexible option because you can set up this user to do whatever you want with any fields you want, but it's also the most laborious because it doesn't have any default fields in it. You have to set everything that you want to store. So if you subclass from the abstract base user model, you basically just get the password management features. So all the automatic hashing that we covered yesterday, you get that in the abstract base user. But in terms of like, they have, a last login time that gets updated automatically, first name, last name, is staff. You would have to set that all and define it if that's what you want on the user model. So the option that I'm going to be suggesting for today this might look really similar. We're going to create a custom user model that inherits from abstract user, not abstract base user, but just abstract user. So in my opinion, subclassing from abstract user it's a good compromise between flexibility and convenience. And so that's what I'm going to be doing in this lecture. And that's probably how I'll build authentication systems throughout this course. But you're free to come to your own conclusions about what is most useful to you, depending on your own needs and what your application does, what your users expect. So you might subclass things a little bit differently. All right, so I'm going to go and build a custom user model now. I'm going to do that in my models.py. Does anybody have any questions about just the user model in Django before I go on customizing it?
And we can inherit from this as many times as we want. So if we have, I guess, a subset of different types of users, so this allows us to have, that if you have different types of users with different access, application, or I guess maybe like a student and staff would be different. Just using that as an example.
So you could create different types of users, but that would put them in different tables then if you're creating different classes. So maybe there's a reason why you want to do that, but from my experience, I would think that you would prefer to put them in the same table and then just have a column that's like, here we even have is staff that distinguishes them. And actually, like, I think it's somewhere in the Django docs, they have a whole paragraph about how staff users are not a different class of users. They just have a Boolean flag set. And for some reason, Django thinks that's an important distinction to make.
So I guess you could use those Booleans to determine access and all that good stuff. You
could, yeah. Tomorrow, though, I'm going to show you about the Django's permission and group system, which is going to show you kind of a more organized way to do that. But for sure, like when I've been working in other server frameworks that don't have like a built-in permission system like that, I don't think there's anything wrong with just adding a Boolean flag for like can delete everything, just to indicate what permissions a user has.
Perfect.
But Django is such a mature, sophisticated framework. It's going to give us power tools for these common problems. Andrew, do you have a question?
I did. So kind of the use of using like Django's built-in user type functions is that it's not just like some class, right? There are probably like functions that run on like certain things in the class that only the Django things work on.
Yes, actually. So that's a very good question. Let me actually jump ahead a little bit so I can answer that question a little bit better. Django cares very much about which of your models is used for representing the user, because lots of other features in Django will automatically interact with the user in certain ways. You know, there are special constraints on the user model. Other models know to interact with it. The sessions in Django will put the user in the session if you're logged in. And so by default, Django knows which model is the user model because it's the user model, it's capital U user. But if you want to use a different model for users, you have to tell Django that specifically. So here I am in my settings.py file. And I'm going to specify auth user model equals blog.appUser. So blog is the application. And I guess I haven't made it quite yet, but I'm going to make an app user model here in just a second. So yeah, since I'm using a custom user model, I have to tell Django about that. And this is how I do that. And now that's going to let the rest of Django hook into my custom user model using all of its like really sophisticated automatic functionality. Yeah, so for one example of something that Django automatically does with the user model is if you visit any page and you have a session, you're logged in currently, Django will automatically fetch your user from the database and attach it to the request in request.user. We'll see that at the end of today, but there are a bunch of automatic things that Django can do with your user model. So it's good that we tell it which one it is. I feel like there was probably a little bit more than you asked for, but does that help?
Yeah, it helps because I was like, why are we making this? We can just like copy paste it if it didn't have anything special with it.
Yeah,
it's just like some random code. Otherwise,
it's got a lot special. Good question though. Any other questions before we just start building this user model?
So this is the first class of the three that you presented to us.
What I'm about to do so we're importing the abstract user from auth models, and then I'm going to create my own class that inherits from it. So that's what we're doing here. And that is option 3 or 4. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so let me define this user model here. So first, most importantly, is email. Now the default user model does have an email field, but I want to define it differently. So I'm going to define my own email field that's going to overwrite the built-in one. So it has a verbose name, which is supposed to be human readable. Edgar?
So because we're using abstract user, there's already an email field, right?
Right. But I don't like how it's gone.
So then if we were using abstract base user, would we have to, like, the way you're creating an email field, would we have to do that for every field we want for our user?
Right.
Okay, cool. Just trying to clarify.
Yeah, so here I'm only going to define the email field because I like all the defaults except for email. Yeah, for the abstract base user, I would have had to define all of these or just whatever I actually wanted. Some people like that level of control, knowing that there's nothing in the table except for what's in their code, but I'm happy to skip a few steps. Okay, so that's how I want to define emails, making sure that you can't have two people with the same email sign up. I want to set those to be unique. Now I've got to set a few model properties here. So I'm saying the username field equals email. So this is a little bit awkward to talk about just because of the use of the word username here. But so when you log in using the Django authentication system, it needs one field from the user model to be used to identify that user, to say, who they are. And Django refers to that field as the username field. By default, the name of the field used for the username field is username. But if we want, we can set a different field to be our username field. So commonly in modern applications, you use your email address to log in because you already need it to sign up and it's unique. So a lot of modern websites just don't even bother asking for a username. It's just email and password. So to get our application to fit that more modern kind of login sign-up flow, we are going to set email to be the username field. So this means that when we log in or sign up, we just send you email and password. And then Django is going to use the email to search the user from the database. And they might not have a username, but it's going to get confusing because there will be times later on where we have to pass in their email as a username field. And it gets a little bit confusing just reading the code if you don't know why Django is calling things that. So we're using email to identify the user and log them in. Jesse, did you raise your hand? Or maybe not. I saw a couple hands go up. Who's got questions?
Yeah, so when you're changing it to email instead of username, why do you need to put it in a string if you're just referencing because you're referencing the attribute above it, right? Just email.
Oh,
or
you're
an email
saying
field?
like, since it's been defined, I could just be like that.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. I'm not sure if Python's class syntax quite works that way, but moreover, this is just what Django expects. I'm just reading the docs and they're telling me this is how I specify the username field as a string. So I'm just doing what the docs are telling me to do.
Roger, Roger.
We had one other question.
Yeah, since you just talked about how we're switching the username field to email, but the base class already has a username, could we just remove the username from the base class or from this like extra class that you're doing so that we never get confused?
I'm not sure how to override the abstract user class to remove a field. Like I could replace it with a different one, but I'm not actually sure how I would use the abstract user and then just remove the username field. If you wanted to not have this field, and I can totally understand why you'd want to get rid of it if it's not part of your application, then I would say that you should subclass from the abstract base user and then just define everything you need. Yeah, sorry, I don't know a more elegant solution to that problem, but it's a good question.
Makes sense.
Any other questions? So here's another thing that we have to declare. This is going to look a little weird. Required fields equals empty array. You might be thinking like, why is that empty? Like obviously there's required data for our user field. You can't just submit an empty object. So the answer is that email and password are required by default. So you don't have to specify them here. you only have to specify additional required fields other than things that Django authentication already needs. So since I don't need any other required fields beyond the default required fields, I'm just going to leave this blank. But I believe that does actually need to be declared. Okay, so I've got my user model here. I'm going to actually update my database with this now. I'm going to make some migrations and then run them. Marcus?
Yeah, real quick before we get too far ahead. What was that you added in the settings?
Django needs to know which model I'm using for users, because normally it's auth.user. That's the default. But here I created my own app user model inside of the blog app. So I have to tell Django that that's the model I'm using for the user.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep. Because Django's gonna, automatically look up your user and do other automatic management as long as they know who your users are. Okay, so let's run some migrations now. Well, we got to make migrations. Now we migrate. Excuse me.
I ran into the same thing on mine. I had to actually drop the database and start fresh. For whatever reason, if you do a migration and then do it again, it doesn't like it.
I mean, I'm about to drop the database, but I should be able to migrate it again. All right, so this is unfortunate. We're just going to drop the database. What do I call this Django on? Okay, create a new database. Excuse me. Oh my gosh, I forgot the semicolon. Okay, let's try this again. Create DB, just did it from the bash shell there. Make migrations. Okay, so that looks better. Sorry. Okay, so now that I have run the migrations, I'm going to take another look in my database. So now you might notice we no longer have the auth user table. That default user model from Django auth that's built in, that's no longer in our database. We got auth group permission, other auth models, but auth user is not here anymore. Instead, we have blog app user, my custom user model that I created. So this guy looks pretty similar, except we've got a unique key on the email now. I'm not sure if we had that before. Yeah, so before just the username was unique, it looks like. So now that's the biggest change in my custom user model is we have unique emails, which I'm going to need because we're going to use that to identify users. So next up, we're gonna need a sign-in route, sign-up route. So I've created my URL already at views.signup. Take a look at that. So pretty simple. I've just got like a basic skeleton here. The signup page, if it gets a GET request, it's going to send that signup HTML template. Or if it gets a POST request, it's going to parse the body, and then we should do other stuff here. I'm going to have to finish this function. Login is pretty simple, pretty similar. On a GET request, we send the page. On a POST request, we're going to parse the body, and then we'll have to do some other work to log the user in. So let's see what my sign up page looks like currently. Excuse me. Oh, let's start the server again. That helps. Okay, we are running the server. All right, so here is my beautiful sign up page. Just going to try to sign up with Jeff Bezos. Password is dragons. I guess I should show you the front end for that real quick. So pretty basic, just a form, taking email and password, and we have a submit button here. And then, is it static, login.js? Oh, so actually, right, signup.js. So actually our signup form does nothing currently. So I'm gonna have to write some code to make it do something. But we can see that the script is running at least. So I got this console log. I know that the static files are hooked up correctly. We're downloading the JavaScript. So let's see here. So we got a form with the ID of sign up form. Say, okay, so when they submit the sign up form, first thing we're going to do is prevent the default behavior. So I can use Ajax to submit this form. So we're going to send a post request to /signup. That was the URL, right? /sign-up. Yeah, okay. Okay, so after the user signs up, we don't want them to just sit on the sign up page. We're going to take them back to the home page. So this is a pretty simple way to do this. I believe last week you would have seen server-side redirects using Django. When someone sends like a regular request, like they type in a URL in their browser, you can redirect that request and send them to a different page. With Ajax, though, you can't really redirect requests. If you do a server-side redirect from Django, the Ajax client, Axios, isn't really going to do anything interesting with that. It just knows that it was told to redirect, but it doesn't like automatically fetch other pages and take you other places. So what we've got here, this is called a client-side redirect. I'm just using JavaScript to send the browser to a different page. Oh, but how could I forget? We need to send some data in our post request. I'm going to send email. Okay, so this should get the values of those two inputs and then send them to the signup route. And then when we get a successful response, should take us back to the home page. So I'm going to inspect this here. What do I want to do? I'm going to actually put a breakpoint in my signup route. And then we're going to try debugging this application. So I'm going to kill my regular server here. I'm going to run start with debugging. Need to make sure I'm using the right virtual environment here. Debug a Django web application. Okay, it looks like it's running. So I'm going to go back to my application and then submit this form. And then immediately when I submit the form, I didn't even press Alt Tab there, Command Tab. The debugger just brought me back to my editor and says like, hey, you've got a breakpoint on this line because I just submitted the post request here. So now I can see all the variables that are defined inside of this request here. So I'm looking at request, we got cookies, files, get, post. Post is actually not what I want. Hang on a second. Oh, this is for the get request. So that's not going to show the body. Okay. What's going on here? Looks like we're not preventing the default form behavior. So I'm going to have to debug my JavaScript here real quick. John, got a question?
Is your breakpoint too high up because it's not able to reach the post request?
So the problem here is that we're not successfully preventing the default form behavior. So it's still just sending a get request. So you can see here those URL parameters, or I'm sorry, the form data got stuck in the URL. So to me, that's a clue that we're still using the default form behavior and it's not actually sending my AJAX request here. So I think I just need to wait for the document to load before I set this event listener. Okay, so let's try that. Gonna go back to views, gonna breakpoint, gonna run it. Submit the form in the request. Okay, post is now a query dict. Or wait, sorry, post not what I wanted. This is still a get request. What is going on here? So it's still not preventing the default form behavior for some reason.
Are you calling this function when you're clicking the submit button? I'm just trying to understand. You're doing it on the document load.
Yeah, the intention is I'm adding the event listener on submit.
Why are you doing the on load? Why don't you just do the defer on the scripts?
Oh yeah, that's definitely what I was forgetting. Thank you. There's a variety of ways that we could have solved this problem, and that suggestion is much better than what I was trying to do. Third. This is the right syntax for deferred, right? We're not missing anything.
It's defer source.
Oh, it's single defer. I don't think the order matters though. Okay, there we go. Jeez. Sorry for the delays and struggles there. Andrew, you have a question?
Just a request.
Yep.
Can you do like a 3-minute walkthrough of like what's happening? Because a lot of the things is it's kind of blurry in my head because like I feel like we use Axios for like 10 minutes like 3 weeks ago, and we're like kind of just coming back to it.
Mhm.
Just from the page load, because I'm understanding you go to views, you're loading your page, and just like a quick walkthrough of like what's happening, because I'm getting a little confused.
Sure. So a lot of the debugging I was just doing, I was just trying to do things quick to get this working. Wasn't trying to teach you anything useful there. But to answer your question, when we send a GET request to log in, so our URLs have the path login. That's handled by this view login. On a GET request, we render blog login.html. Login.html has a script tag, login.js. So when the HTML file loads, our browser sees that there's a script tag. It has to send another request to get that script. So then it sends a request to Django for static login.js. Django sends that file down. And then the file executes. So in the signup example, because the script was deferred, this should run at the end of the page load after the body has all been loaded and we can access these elements that I'm trying to look for. But yeah, the first thing it does is just add an event listener. So it's not immediately running all this code. It's just preparing for a user action, saying that when a user submits this form, this is what we're going to do. Does that help?
Yeah, and the reason why afterwards, when it's not a post, when it's a post request, that's why we have to use JSON, right? Because we're using JavaScript and we're getting the information from Axios and JSON.
Yeah, generally with AJAX requests, you're gonna deal with JSON as your input and output.
Yeah, that's if you could go back to the views thing, that's what I was a little confused about. When you're like requesting, so when you get the body equals JSON loads request body, what is that getting?
So that's actually the next thing I want to show you as soon as I was able to figure out why the form wasn't submitting. So why don't I just start up my debugger again. Okay. Okay, so we're at the sign up page. Bezos, Dragons, submit that. Okay, here we go, geez. So a couple things I want to point out here. So now I'm in the debugger handling a post request. We can actually see method is post. So this isn't the request to just get the HTML page. This is the request to submit the sign up form. So you'll note that the request.post variable, this is empty. This doesn't always have the data for post requests. This is only for form requests. So the like URL encoded forms, kind of like the forms that we worked with last week and the weeks before that, you would find that in post. But for JSON data coming from an AJAX request, that would be in the body. But now the problem is here, this is just a raw string. This is not even a regular Python string. You can see the B here. This is like a byte string. That's what they call it. But this is the body data that I wanted. So I just had to do one more step now to convert this body string into a Python dictionary. Jesse, did I see a hand go up?
Yes. The question I had on the front end in the HTML, the URL link, you had a original where it showed the username and the password in the URL link. How were you able to make sure that didn't happen in the JavaScript, or because you said you had to make sure that the username and password was not in the URL link anymore?
Oh, because where did I put that? Because I'm sending a post request, the data is in the body. So for GET requests, your only option is to include the data in the URL. But for a post request, you can put it in the URL or in the body. And so since we're submitting passwords, we want the extra security. And so we're going to put this data in the body. Does that help?
Yeah, okay. I was just trying to see how you got the URL off of the URL link. Okay.
Bao, did your hand go up?
Yes, thank you. I'm just confused. So are you using like JavaScript to kind of parse all the information that we used to do with Python in our views method, that when there's a post request and we just get all our information in our view method, you just did it differently in the front end? Is that what the Axios like doing right here? I'm just trying to get my head around.
Axios is just a different way that we can send data from our front end to our back end. So before we would have used the traditional form submission, just using an HTML form, like with the named inputs. And we're still using that in part, but here we're also manually using Axios to say what data we want to send to the server. Because like this is going to help us build more dynamic Ajax-based applications in the near future. So I want us to get accustomed to sending data and getting responses with Ajax using Axios. But yeah, one difference doing things this way is that all of our data is going to be in JSON going over the internet, which is why in Django, we have to use the JSON module in order to parse it.
So you're saying this way will be more dynamic towards the future when we're building a website?
Yeah,
Is
it's
that what-
more flexible, I'd say.
Thank you.
Andrew?
My question has to do with your breakpoint on line 18. So when I saw that it's paused on line 18, but we can on line 18 here, but we can still see the we're still able to see your body data. It's because your Axios post request already went through, right?
So at line 18, the raw body is on the request, at request.body. So from the very start of the function, you'd be able to see the raw body. What you would not see is the parsed body, because that doesn't happen until line 21. But while we've been chatting, I just stepped forward a few times. So now my debugger is on line 23. So I can look at the parsed body, which you can now see that's the second local variable for is just the request. Now we've got this body. It's a Python dictionary with email and password. Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, so there I've loaded the body. We can see that I got it in a dictionary. So now I'm going to create a user object. Sean, you have a question?
Yeah, I just need to just making sure. So JSON that loads, it basically makes that string into a Python object, right? Or Python dictionary.
Yeah. Okay, so after we loaded the body, we need to create our user. So first I'm going to import them. So from .models, import app user. That's what I named them. Access the app user model. So normally you've seen, objects.create. That's a pretty common method that all Django models have. We're using something slightly different here, a built-in method called create user. I think. Let me just check out P-SQL real quick here. Okay, so we have no app users currently for our blog. So I'm going to try to register a person. Make it a valid email, why not? Dragons. So again, that redirected to the home page. Looks like we signed in successfully. I'm going to take another look in P-SQL. Okay, so now I've got some data in here. Let's try to format this a little bit differently so we can read it more easily. So this is that user object that was just inserted into the database. Just now, that was not correct though. What's that? I could have sworn I read in the docs that email was required by default. Maybe just set that to an empty string. Either way, that is not exactly what I wanted to happen.
Is it because on line 24, you set username equal to the email?
Right. So this is what I was talking about before, how it gets confusing. Like when Django says username, is it saying username or is it actually talking about the email field that we're using to log the user in? So I think when you register, it actually needs to be the name of the actual fields. But then when we log the user in, we're going to say that their username is email. So this is something that trips me up sometimes. So let's try this again. Oh, got to start the server. So it's not saying we're working. So
Saying you have to have username.
Apparently username is required. Maybe I should have just used an abstract base user model and set it up all custom to just not have the username. Starting to think back to Andrew's comment earlier and thinking maybe I should have done that to begin with. I'm not sure. Anyway, Django wants the username. We're going to set their username to also be their email. Okay, that looks like it was successful. Okay, so I've registered a user in one line of code, just objects.createUser. So note here, that we pass in the password, we just pass in whatever is on the body. And I showed you in the debugger before, that was just their plain text password, whatever was typed into the input field. But you will note that the password field on the user in the database is not the plain text password that they typed in, but this is their salted hash. So if we go to the Django docs, they actually explain how Django stores passwords. They tell you how to read that hash, what it all means. But I'll just explain to you really quickly. If you look at this string real quick, you can see that there are a few $signs in it, and that separates the different like parts of this hash. So the first part here before the first $sign, this is just which hashing algorithm was used to create this hash. So Django by default uses SHA-256, and that's just what this is telling you here. Next part before the next $sign is the number of iterations. I've heard this sometimes referred to as the work factor, because when you hash a password, you don't actually hash it just once, but it's often hashed multiple times in a row using the same algorithm. The point is just to make it take longer, because if a hashing algorithm is too fast, then it's possible for someone to guess 1 billion passwords in an hour. So you want to make the algorithm slow enough that it's not easy for a hacker to guess all the passwords in your database, but still quick enough that users can log in, in the blink of an eye. The next section here, this is their salt between the second and third $sign. And then after that $sign to the end, this is the actual hash. So when the user logs in, Django is automatically going to take this string over here and then concatenate that to the password they logged in with, and then confirm that it is equal to this. But you don't have to think about that anymore, or at least you don't have to look at it anymore, because Django is going to handle that automatically for you. But I do think it's important that you understand, how this was constructed, and just so you know to handle it properly. You don't accidentally compromise your application security because you don't understand how hashes work. All right, so that's signing up. The last major part of this demo is going to be logging in. Those two things kind of go together. Does anybody have any questions though? And then I think this would be a good time to take a break.
Raphael, is there any way that you could push your code so far up somewhere like during the break? Because I feel like I'm missing some stuff, and that would be awesome if you could do that.
Sure. And there it is.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Not right now. Okay, well, it's almost 10:40. Let's take a quick break, come back at 10:50, and I'm going to show you all how we can log this user in. All right, so let's build our login route now that we've been able to sign our user up. Sorry, was there a question just now, John?
Yeah, I copied over your code and everything, but when I ran my migrations, and then I look at my database, I still see the auth user table, and it didn't switch over to whatever my app name .app user.
Did you do make migrations or just migrate?
I did both.
He's probably gonna have to delete the old migrations before you can run the new ones. That's what I do with mine.
If you do make migrations after creating a custom user model, it should use that user model when you migrate instead of the default one. Like we can see in my P-SQL, I don't have the default user model.
But his database is going to be in a different state than yours. So the migrations won't be at the same point.
Yeah. So I guess I'm not really sure what would happen if you already migrated and you already have that auth user table. So I guess you might be in a different state. Yeah, it's reasonable.
So should I just delete my migrations and then run it again? Like migrate again?
I'm not exactly sure what the best idea would be. Maybe if you can undo the migrations, just roll them back and then try to rerun them. That might leave you in a better state. I'm not exactly sure. I would have to debug it offline probably to know what the best solution would be. Sorry. Do we have any other questions? Kat?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about the structure. Is having static be in the root folder instead of in the app folder like a design choice, or does that need to be there for the JS files?
It's kind of a design choice. So it's not like the first way that Django tells you to manage your static files. They tell you that each app should have their own static files folder. I personally think that the way that Django manages static files is kind of bizarre, because when you go to actually deploy your application, you're not going to want to have the static files mixed into all the different apps. What you're going to need is one static folder at the root of your project that your web server can find easily. And so in fact, Django actually has built-in methods. So if we look at like, just run manage.py, wait, where'd they go? It's not seeing all of the commands. It's not loading my settings correctly for some reason. Thought this was the right, maybe this is the wrong virtual environment. Anyways, the point is that with the Django admin, there's a built-in command called collect static that will copy all of the static files from your different apps and put them into this folder at the top level. So when you go to deploy your app, this is actually what you need in the end anyway. It's just one static folder at the top level. So I'm just kind of skipping a step and just organizing my files like that to begin with. Also, when we get to React, this is how React is going to want you to organize your static files. If you've got like images or songs or just the JavaScript or just the like CSS files, other static files, React is going to expect you to have just one folder at the top level of your project where you put all of those images and other static files. So just like to get us prepared for blending Django with React and just kind of their slightly different expectations about how static files are managed, this I thought was a more elegant way to manage them. It involves me doing less maintenance, less work in the long term, and prepares us for integrating React later. But there are certainly a lot of ways that you can manage your static files in Django. And this is a design choice that I made. Does that help?
Yeah. So then you're going to put your CSS in here too versus having it in the app folder, right?
Yeah. Yeah, the CSS would all go in the static folder. And ideally there would be subfolders in here like static/CSS, static/JS. But this was a pretty small demo, so I didn't get that organized.
Okay, thanks. That helps.
Yep.
Did you have to change anything in the settings, like for the static file location, for that to work?
Yeah, where'd that guy go? Settings, static files, DIRs. You can get this from the Django documentation. There's a pretty good page on managing static files, which I would recommend you read because it's not as straightforward as I would hope it would be.
Okay, cool.
So this is just saying from the base directory, there's a static folder. So that's this guy right here. That's all. Okay, so we're dealing with logins now. So we know get request just sends the login HTML page. Post request, I'm going to parse the body and then pick some pieces off of that. Get email. So there's our email and password. Just pluck them off the body. And then, see, hang on, I need to import something real quick. Sorry, hang on just a second. So what I need is Django.contrib.auth models. Wait, no, .auth. Okay, 3 methods that Django provides us in Django contrib.auth. They do what they sound like. They're very useful. I'm going to show those in just a second. So next thing we do is we're going to look up the user from the database. But Django has a special way of helping us with that. So we're calling this authenticate method, but I want to be clear about what this does. This doesn't actually log a user in. It just returns the user object that corresponds with these credentials. Because remember, I can't just look up a user where password equals password because the user typing their password into the form is not typing in their hash. So I can't just compare those directly. I would have to hash what they typed in, given their salt, and then compare it to the hash in the database. But Django does that for me. So that's what the authenticate method does. It just compares their credentials against the hash in the database and tells us which user matches these credentials. So that's going to return some value. It might be none if we don't find a user. But if it's not none, so we do find a user, first we have to check if they're active. Because we can have non-active users in our system. So you might have noticed this field is active and defaults to true. I did actually, wait, did I? No, I don't think this is in my model. It's just part of the default user model. So the idea for this flag here is in a modern application, you don't ever actually delete really anything, and you certainly don't ever delete users. If you want to pretend like a user doesn't exist in your database and like they shouldn't be able to log in as them anymore, you can set is active false. So that way you don't lose the data, but you've effectively removed that user from the application. Andrew, question?
I might have missed it, but for authenticate, when you do password to equal to password, is it automatically hashing their thing?
Right. That's all the magic of authenticate, is that it is automatically looking up this user by their email, grabbing their hash from the database, and then grabbing the salt from that hash, concatenating that salt to this password, hashing it, and then comparing it with the hash in the database. So that's all happening in this one function call. All that manual work that we were struggling over yesterday That just happens automatically in this one function call. But again, remember, we told Django that the email was being used as the username field. So that's why we have to say username and password. Authenticate always takes username and password, even if you use a different field to log them in other than username. Is there another hand up?
Yeah, going back to your is active, is it similar to, say, if someone unsubscribed from your site, would that be what that does? Be as active as to false is kind of like what unsubscribe does when we click it?
I mean, it depends. Like, if you unsubscribe from a mailing list, that website could just delete your email from, you know, the list of people who are supposed to receive emails or whatever. But more likely is they're just going to mark you as inactive, or just mark you as like, don't send emails, or, you know, don't send like weekly updates or whatever to this person. So yeah, they probably do something similar. Because figure, if you're on an email list somewhere, someone's just trying to harvest your data, basically, and they're not going to let go of it easily. So asking yourself to be removed from an email list probably doesn't delete you. You probably just get marked as inactive somewhere. Make sense?
Yeah, I just always like to think of real world applications when looking at it. So, and I'm doing metaphors in my head, analogies.
Cool. Yeah, it's a great way to learn things. Just compare things to what you already know. All right, so if the user is active, we're going to try. All right, so we've got some perfunctory error handling here. In theory, you should be pretty smart about how you handle login and sign up errors. That's one of the most sensitive parts of your application. You should think through all the, you know, different possibilities of how it can fail and how you want to handle that. But here we're just gonna print out the error, leave that as an exercise to the reader of how we should actually handle this. Great, so if they log in successfully, we just send them a generic success message. If the user is not active, we'll tell them that. And if the user is not found, we let the client know. That we could not find the user. This on the sign up page. So let's look at our signup.js. I'm sorry, login.js. We already signed up. We're logging in now. So it's going to be pretty similar to the sign up script. So I'm just going to copy this over. Generally, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I'm just a little confused about like the difference between the JSON response and the HTTP response.
It's just a different format for the data. Let's see. So HTTP response is just going to send a plain string down to the client, whereas JSON response is sending more like a dictionary. It's a JSON string that the client can then convert into a JavaScript object. At this point, I don't really care too much what I'm sending back. It's just that I have to send something to the client. I suppose since these are going to be AJAX requests, it would be more proper to send a JSON response. So let's just do that. So something like that, since we're talking about more of a JavaScript or a JSON interface, we're going to get AJAX requests with JSON data to these routes, and then we can send a response with JSON data as well. So that's a little bit more consistent, but it's not hugely important for today's demo. Good question though. It's good that you're noticing these little discrepancies here. Any other questions at the moment? Jesse?
So going back to the is active, and you're saying if the user is active, if you want the user who already has the email and all that in to from non-active to being active again, are we going to be going over on how we do that, or?
I mean, it's just a Boolean field in the database, so you would just.
But for the
it.
user, are they going to be like redirected to re-register or something like that?
Oh, you would probably just give them an error message and say their account has been locked.
Okay.
Because you wouldn't let them sign in or register again with the same email address.
Right, right. So, I mean, would this be something like call help desk and then someone will have to go in and manually change it?
Right. Yeah, you would have to use the Django admin to set this T to an F, because there wouldn't be an API within the application to set users from active to inactive.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yep. Okay, so this should log our user in. Let's see if we can get a successful response back. Got my login to JS. Post to login. Handle events on login form. Right, okay, so I think I changed everything that needs to change here. So we can try submitting this login form. Okay, so that redirected us back to the home page. So I think my front end thinks that was successful. Got this response back and it redirected us. We did not throw any errors.
Well, we're not validating the response. We're just going to redirect as long as we got one. So even if success is false, it would still redirect to the home page, right?
That's true. I guess there's a possibility that the server would throw an error and then fail to send a response at all. But yeah, we're not doing very good validation here. So that's certainly one of the most time-consuming parts of building an authentication system, is just handling all the different possibilities of different errors you can get and how you want to redirect the user, what messaging you want to send them. Some kind of a pop-up that tells them what went wrong and how they can proceed. That touches on a lot of UX as well. And I think properly covering that would be just too much for one lecture. Yeah, I'm just trying to talk about the authentication mechanisms in Django. Making this comfortable and convenient for users is another big task. Okay, but now let's go back to the index. You notice I've got this print statement here, looking at request.user. If I refresh the home page, converts it to a string, says it's Jeff Bezos, Amazon.com. Let's actually look at the whole user object, not just the string version of it. I'm gonna set a breakpoint over there. I'm gonna start debugging. Okay, I refresh the home page. It's showing me I've got one local variable. It's the request. We do have a session. You know, because Django automatically is managing these sessions for us now in order to implement logins, but I don't really have to think about this. I'm just happy to know it's here. Okay, but importantly, there's now this new property, request.user. So actually, this property should always exist, request.user, but these properties will be different if you're logged in or not. So if you're not logged in, is anonymous will be true, is authenticated will be false. But because we're logged in now, anonymous is false and authenticated is true. And then we can also see all the other information about this user. So they have user ID 2, they are active, they are not staff or super user. Last login time is here. So this is one of the useful features of using the abstract user model instead of the base abstract user model. So this is just one of the automatic features I get from Django using their user model, is it just automatically updates the time when the user logged in last. This is a pretty useful thing to have, and it's kind of nice actually for all of your database models to know when they were last modified, but it's kind of a hassle to do that to set that up manually, make sure everything gets updated whenever it gets changed. You know, every time a user logs in, you change their last login date. It's just a hassle to remember. So it's cool that Django does this automatically for us. Jesse?
Yeah, so from yesterday's lecture, talking about cookies, how is that different now that we're using the Django aspect with cookies and what we need to know?
So cookies are still being used. Can't type in my console for some reason. Hang on, sorry. Oh, because the tab is frozen. Geez. So I think that Django's cookies are HTTP only. So except for the CSRF token, these are just ones that I've set manually. So maybe this doesn't demonstrate what I'm trying to say. But basically, cookies are still being used. It's just that Django is setting them for us automatically. So yeah, here, if I go to cookies, we've got session ID. So this is actually being set automatically by Django, just to remember that this is the same machine, the same computer that's sending multiple requests. And this is also what connects my computer with the user object in the database. So every time I send a request, Django is automatically checking this session ID and then confirming that, oh yeah, this belongs to an active session. And that active session corresponds to a user in the database. So Django looks up that user in the database and attaches it to request.user. So it's still using cookies, it's still using sessions. Everything that I showed you yesterday is still happening. It's just that Django is managing it for you automatically. Sound good?
Yes, yeah, sounds good. I just trying to see how we're going to work with the session as far as persistence with putting things into a cart or things of that nature and seeing how that will work.
Mhm.
Making sure, I don't know if you'll go over that or not, but yeah.
I mean, if you want to add something to the user's session that isn't like stored in the database for that user, it's just something you want to remember while they're browsing a few different pages, you can still access request.session. We still have access to this. Just for kind of temporary data that should persist, for a few hours or just while they're on the site currently. But under the hood, Django is also using those cookies and those sessions to log you in and keep you logged in and to remember which user you are on every request.
Okay, and with that particular session, like say they were putting items into a cart and then they just decide to log in, then they'll be able to match that session to that user. They log in.
That is something you could potentially do. I was saying earlier this morning that I might only do that for registration, for sign up, but not for login. That's just kind of a design decision I've made. But you could do what you're talking about. Have like the session for an unauthenticated user and then add all that information in their session to their user account when they log in and you know who they are in the database.
Okay, all right, thanks.
See, I'm going to try to just render the user on the home page. We got to start the server. Hang on, I got to figure out how to access the user's username. Hang on, I'm going to take another look at this real quick. We got request dot user dot username. Okay, I'm just gonna pass it in manually. It's a little awkward sometimes trying to convert the Django objects into dictionaries.
Does that mean that it has to be turned into a JSON thing again to turn into a dictionary with Django?
Not JSON exactly, because JSON is a string, but
Oh, right.
a dictionary. It's like a JSON object. I mean, Python dictionaries are very similar to JavaScript objects. So yeah, we need to pass in a dictionary of some sort here. request. Dot user.
Yeah, Raphael, I don't know if it helps others, but when I'm trying to debug stuff, I just copy what I'm trying to look at. In this case, the request.user to username, I highlight it and just right click and evaluate in debug console.
Saying you just highlight, right click. And then what was that?
Evaluate debug console. So it's returning the correct thing.
Is it?
You're looking for the email, right? It's in your debug console.
Oh, right here. Yeah, I just saw something flash on the left side and I was really confused. Okay, cool. That's interesting. Thanks. So why is this not interpolating then? Putting in the username.
Yeah, I think if you hit continue, it'll do it correct this time because it won't apply the code changes until after it runs.
Is that, oh my gosh, you're right. That is what happened. Okay. So we're interpolating my name into the page here. Welcome to my blog, jeffbezos@amazon.com. So we don't have usernames, so we just address the user by their email. It's good enough for now. But anyway, so that proves that I was able to log in because now I'm able to access the user from request.user. So I didn't have to like look them up in the database manually. Django does that for me automatically. So then one last thing is we should probably have the ability to log out. So this one's going to be real simple. Redirect in Django. We're going to redirect. Where do we want to redirect to? Actually, we're not going to do this. We're going to just send some JSON back. So from the index, button type equals button, because the default type is submit actually. get Axios. And we're going to have our own custom script here as well. It's main.js. Make a file for that. So when we click on the logout button, we're already on the home page, so there's really nowhere to redirect to. We are going to reload the page. Since our front end isn't dynamic yet, we're going to reload the page just to see any updates that happen when we log out. All right, so we got our home page. It seems to know that I'm logged in. It says, says my name, got it off the request user object. Try to log out. Doesn't seem to like that. Let's debug real quick. Okay, so I don't actually have a URL defined for that. Log out. Log out. Reload, I think that's right. Okay, so it did sign me out before. There was just an error with the reloading the page. Let's go back to login again. I'm Jeff Bezos, password's dragons. Log in, it redirects me to the home page. And at the home page, it's able to access request.user. And that's how it's able to just put it right into the page in my template. If I log out, this is going to send a request to Django, calling the logout function with my user object passed in, and basically just telling Django to end the session for this user. So then I log out, it redirects me back to the same page, just refreshes the page. But now my browser is no longer sending up those cookies, and Django is no longer keeping track of my user session, doesn't know who this machine belongs to. I'm now an unauthenticated user. So yeah, we can see in the console here, I am now an unauthenticated user. If I go to my views, where is that coming from? Yeah, request.user, I'm unauthenticated now, or anonymous. Jesse, do you have a hand up?
No, but I do have a question.
Let's hear it.
So I'm was just looking over at how when you're logging out, I'm looking at your JS and I'm just trying to understand how your logout session from your from here is interacting with clicking the button. log out? Or maybe I missed that when you're from the different pages.
So I click the button log out. On index.html, we got a button with the ID of logout. In our main.js, we get the element with that ID logout, and we add an event listener so that when we click on that button, it's going to do this. Axios sends a GET request to /logout, and then when it gets a response, refreshes the page. So sending a GET request to /logout, if we look at urls.py, we have a handler for the path logout at views.logout. So we go to views.py, and here's that function, logout, which just really does one thing, calls the logout function that Django Auth provides us. So this ends our session. And then we send a JSON response saying that we were successful, did what you asked.
Okay, thank you. So that kind of clears things up.
Yep. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was curious, like in your template file, I guess you could, based off of the user's login status, you can change what text and things show on the page, right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, so now that you have access to the user, you could get access to whether if you know they're logged in or not, you could change the text on the screen. So if it's, you know.
Yeah, so right here, this isn't very smart. It just puts their username in, and if their username is none, then it just has none. But in theory, you should be doing some like smart Jinja stuff here. Just like, you know, if username, and then you have entirely different markup if they are logged in or if they're not.
That's what I'm talking about.
I guess you wouldn't be using Jinja. Pretty soon we'll be doing that kind of thing in React.
Nice.
But yeah, it's definitely something to think about. What other questions do we have? Let me show you one other thing I kind of like. So for pretty much every web application I build, I will make a route called who am I? This is intended to be used from the front end with Ajax. So when we get to React, you know, your front end is going to be somewhat disconnected from your back end in some ways because it's not Django rendering its own templates for the front end. So what's going to happen a lot is you have a situation where on any page load, that page is going to want to know, like, you know, who is logged in and what do we know about them? Maybe you know that they are logged in because the request was successful. You didn't get like a 401 error, 403 error, but the front end doesn't know everything about the user. So I will very commonly define a route just called who am I? And then pretty much every page on the front end is going to send a GET request here when it starts to figure out who is logged in, what do we know about them. Practically, you'd probably want to send more than just the email, but you definitely don't want to send everything about the user because some of that doesn't belong on the front end. right, so we're gonna have a little bit of homework tonight. Where's that? So for the homework, we've got 2 exercises. Now, just looking at the descriptions of these exercises, these are originally just basic CRUD apps. From the descriptions, it doesn't say it has anything to do with authentication or logging in. But the challenge, which part of the requirements are listed here in the assignments section, we want you to complete these exercises, but also add sign up, login, and log out functionality to these exercises. So like for the to-do list, just like by default, just reading the requirements here, these to-dos are not unique to an individual user. They're just like all in the same database. And so if multiple users are accessing the same to-do app, they're going to see the same to-dos. So your challenge for tonight is to build a to-do list application, but that's pretty similar to things you've done in the past with Django RM. But we're going to ask you to also build a to-do list where individual users can sign up and log in and have their own personal to-dos. So we're going to recommend that you use all the Django authentication features we showed you today, just like log in, log out, authenticate, create user. We're not going to be doing this manually like we did yesterday. I want you to get accustomed at this point to the high-powered automatic tools that Django provides us. And then the other exercise is pretty similar. It's another CRUD app. And this one's a little bit more sophisticated, so we give you a little bit of starter code, but it's not much. But again, we're going to ask you to add sign up, log in, log out functionality to this exercise so that every user has their own individual event calendar instead of sharing it with other users. So does anyone have any questions about the lecture, the exercises, what we did today, what we're doing tomorrow, life, the universe, anything? Nothing?
I think we just need to get it hands-on in order to kind of like get everything.
Say again?
I said, I think we just need to all get hands-on and actually do the assignments to actually kind of see where the questions are. If that makes sense.
For sure. Yeah, it totally makes sense. Yeah, there's a lot going on here. A lot happens automatically, but you'll definitely discover some headaches and some obstacles once you try to actually apply it. So yeah, I look forward to your questions later this afternoon. A couple other hands went up.
Yeah, can I ask about the to-do list? So basically in the end, like, is every user going to have their own like table of to-dos essentially?
Not their own table, but in the to-dos table, you'd have a column for the user ID, and that's how you would know which user that individual to-do belongs to.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And so then, yeah, when you're like fetching all the to-dos, just put them in the list, you don't actually get all the to-dos, but all the to-dos that belong to the currently logged in user. Was there another question?
Hi, Raphael. We were disabling the CSRF token just so we don't have to put it in the forms. But since we're using the Django authentication, should we start getting used to using the tokens, or is that not a big deal?
I don't want to say it's not a big deal, but I'm not going to ask you to worry about that now. The thing is that the way you satisfy the CSRF requirement is a little bit different with AJAX, and it's a little bit trickier with AJAX than it is with the traditional form submissions. But moreover, in like a week or so, we're going to be kind of changing how we write our routes a little bit. Instead of using the default Django views, we're going to use a tool called Django REST Framework that will have us write our views in a slightly different way, and also has you satisfy the CSRF requirement in a slightly different way. So I don't want us to bother too much about how to properly satisfy CSRF until we're actually using Django REST framework, because that's when we're going to be more like learning a more like proper and kind of final way to do things. Here, I'm just trying to illustrate concepts. And so it's not as important if you know how to handle the CSRF tokens with AJAX requests with the default view handlers, because in a week or so, we're going to use a slightly different setup and you'd have to learn a slightly different way to handle CSRF.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? All right.
I got a question, but I got a comment. So tomorrow we're doing the retro, correct?
Correct.
It's going to be hosted by Nathan, and Nathan's theme is favorite Mario game. So
Yes.
pick your favorite Mario game, and yeah, Nathan's going to be the host.
Cool. Looking forward to it.
Nothing past Nintendo Wii doesn't count.
All right. I was hoping everyone would pick a classic anyway, but we'll see.
Nothing past as in Wii or like through our age. So like N64 is good, GameCube's good, Super Nintendo. That's what I meant. Sorry.
Okay, but you get bonus points if you pick a game from the 90s. So yeah, we're doing pair programming today. So I'm gonna generate some pairs in just a few minutes. Gonna open the breakout room after lunch, after we finish recording today's video. I guess actually I can stop recording that now.